Hey everyone, welcome back. I know a lot of you are here today because, well, you're thinking about your kid. Maybe
Yeah.
you're noticing they seem a little more worried than usual,
Mm.
maybe a bit anxious, and you want to figure out like what's going on underneath, right?
Absolutely.
So today we're diving deep into some of the more, I guess you could say, hidden triggers of childhood
It
anxiety.
is so important to look beyond what we might think of as the typical or the obvious stuff,
Right.
because childhood anxiety is really on the rise. I think it's estimated that something like 1 in 8 kids are going to experience some form of anxiety.
Wow, 1 in 8.
Yeah, that's a pretty big number,
Yeah.
and I think it really tells us that we need to be looking at all the different factors.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we are talking about it a lot more than we used to, which is great.
Definitely.
But that statistic really does tell us there's a lot more to learn about what's causing it. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to try to move past some of that, like, standard advice that's out there
Yeah.
and really get into some of the less obvious things that could be, adding to your child's anxieties.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, what we're trying to do is help you raise kids who are emotionally strong.
Yeah, we want to give you some insights that might not be the first things you think of
Yeah.
when you think about, anxiety in kids.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's get started. So the first hidden trigger we're going to talk about is something that I think a lot of us can kind of fall into,
Yeah.
myself included sometimes. It's this idea of overscheduling and not having enough downtime.
Yes.
We all want to give our kids, every opportunity in the world, right? So
Mhm.
it's music lessons, sports, play dates, tutoring, and
Whoa.
before you know it, the calendar is just packed.
Yeah, I think it comes from a really well-intentioned place, this desire to
Yeah.
enrich our kids' lives and
Give them every chance.
exactly, give them every chance. Yeah. But I think what's really interesting to think about is like the impact that this constant go, go, go kind of lifestyle
Yeah.
has on, a young developing nervous system.
Yeah, exactly. And the research we looked at really kind of highlights how all of this constant stimulation, it can actually overwhelm kids.
Yeah.
It overwhelms their systems and they're not getting that time to just kind of like
Decompress.
decompress. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find so fascinating about this is, you might call it white space
Yeah.
in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like a piece of music needs pauses
Mm-hmm.
to give the notes, meaning
Right.
I think a child's mind also really needs, unscheduled time to rest and just to daydream,
Yeah.
and importantly, to process emotions.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So without that, like all those bumps in the road, all those big feelings that they're having throughout the day,
Yeah.
they don't have a chance to kind of settle.
Yeah, exactly.
To process those. I think one of the sources used a really, really good analogy. They talked about a pressure cooker,
Right.
and all that emotional pressure just builds up if you're not giving it away to kind of release.
I love that. I think
Yeah.
that's such a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
It really highlights how unstructured time, it's not just time that's being wasted.
Right.
It's such a valuable opportunity for children to really, follow their interests,
Uh-huh.
explore their own imaginations, and just process without having that constant, external input.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something that might not be the first thing you think of when you think about emotions.
Yeah.
And that's food.
Okay.
This next hidden trigger, it's the prevalence of processed foods
Oh,
and,
yeah.
all that added sugar that's in a lot of the things that kids eat.
Yeah. If we think about the big picture of our well-being,
Yeah.
the physical and the mental, they're totally intertwined, right?
Cool.
And so it makes sense that diet would play a role in emotional state.
Right. And the research, it really points out that so many of these like kid-friendly foods that we grab
Right.
because they're convenient, right?
Yeah. Totally.
Things like, those yogurts with all the colors or those juice boxes,
Mhm.
even granola bars, they can be loaded with sugar,
Yeah.
artificial dyes, all sorts of additives.
And what's really interesting is that those ingredients can actually directly affect, our little ones' bodies,
Right.
right? So things like blood sugar levels, if those are fluctuating rapidly, that can really lead to irritability,
Yeah.
mood swings, even feelings of anxiety.
Wow.
It's a physiological response.
It's so interesting because you think, you're giving them a treat or something that they like,
Yeah,
but actually it could be making them feel worse.
absolutely.
One of the sources we looked at, they specifically called out food dyes,
Uh-huh.
like red 40 and yellow 5. And they talked about, the research that's been done linking those to behavioral issues.
It really makes you think about, what are we truly giving our kids?
Yeah.
What are we nourishing them with?
Beyond the calories, right?
Beyond the calories, exactly.
Yeah. So what can people listening do about that?
Well, I think, starting with simple swaps is a great first step.
Okay.
Right. So instead of those processed snacks, maybe opting for some, fresh fruit,
Okay.
handful of nuts, or some whole grain options.
So simple swaps. I like that.
Yeah. And if you're really interested in seeing, what kind of impact this can have,
Yeah.
one of the sources suggested a little experiment just for a week, really being mindful of how much added sugar your child is getting.
Okay.
And see if you notice any changes in their behavior.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. It can be really illuminating.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so our next hidden trigger. This one is, well, it's kind of hard to avoid in today's world.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's too much screen time.
Right.
These are everywhere.
It's your challenge.
It really
It's
is.
our families today, right?
Yeah. And, screens can be great. They can be great for learning, for staying connected.
Mm-hmm.
But what we found is that too much exposure, especially if it's, really fast-paced stuff, or it doesn't have like a clear purpose, it can actually have some downsides.
Yeah, what's really interesting is if you look at what's going on in the brain.
Right.
Screens can be super overstimulating for a young developing brain, right? And so
Yeah.
you think about those dopamine cycles that are so important
Right.
for pleasure and motivation.
Yeah.
Those can be affected. And I think even more significantly, using screens, especially close to bedtime, can disrupt sleep.
Yes. And we all know that good sleep is so important.
What's huge.
Not just for, physical health, but for emotional well-being too.
For sure.
Yeah. The research shows that when kids don't get enough good quality sleep, their ability to regulate their emotions, it really takes a hit.
Totally.
They're going to get frustrated easier.
Yeah.
They're going to be more irritable and, more prone to anxiety.
Exactly. And, for older kids who are using social media,
Oh, yeah, that's a whole...
that adds another layer.
Another layer to it.
The constant comparison, that pressure to present a certain image,
Oh, yeah.
all of that can really contribute to anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can we do? Screens are everywhere. What do we do about all this screen time?
Well, the first thing I think is setting limits.
Okay.
Right. Clear and consistent limits.
Right.
And then I love the idea of creating these screen-free zones in your house.
I like that. Yeah.
Like bedrooms, the dinner table. Those are great places to start.
Yeah.
But I think really the most important thing is actually encouraging
Yeah.
real-world activities, right? So things like arts and crafts,
Yeah.
reading a book,
Yeah.
getting outside.
Playing.
Yeah.
It's that balance, right?
It is. It is. It's getting them to engage with the world in a more, grounded way.
Okay. Let's move on to the next hidden trigger. This one is, I think, maybe a little bit more sensitive, but it's so important. And it's this idea of how parental stress and the emotional atmosphere of our homes can actually be a trigger.
Right. It's subtle,
Ooh.
but it's so powerful.
Yes. And what we learned is that kids are incredibly sensitive
Oh, yeah.
to the emotional environment around them.
For sure.
I love how one of the sources described kids as being emotional sponges.
It's a good one, yeah.
It's such a good visual, right?
Yeah.
They just soak it all up.
Yeah, they absorb the feelings around them even if they don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah, like if there's, tension over finances or there's relationship stuff happening, even just the everyday pressures of life, kids are picking up on that.
Totally. And so, if you connect that to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
a home environment that's tense or where there's a lot of disconnect can actually, create this underlying sense of unease or worry for kids. And it might not be something they can put into words.
Right.
But it can come out as anxiety.
And I think it's really important to say here, no one is expecting you to be a perfect parent.
Of course not.
Right. We all have our moments.
We all have our stuff.
We get stressed. We get overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
The goal isn't to be perfectly calm all the time.
Yeah. I think what's more helpful is to really prioritize our own well-being.
Yes.
Right.
Modeling healthy coping skills.
Exactly. And then, really creating those small moments of connection. Things like a bedtime chat or just some one-on-one time.
Just that connection
could really make a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's so key. Okay, so we've got one more hidden trigger to talk about.
Okay.
And this is one that we've touched on a bit, but it's really important to dive into. And it's sleep.
Sleep, yeah.
getting enough good quality sleep.
It's so fundamental.
It is. And I think sometimes we forget
Yeah.
sleep isn't just about resting our bodies.
Right.
It's actually a really active time for our brains,
It is.
especially when it comes to processing our emotions.
Yeah, the brain's busy consolidating memories,
Right.
regulating emotional responses.
Wow.
All kinds of things are happening when we sleep.
So it makes sense that if kids aren't getting enough good quality sleep,
Yeah.
they're going to be more susceptible to mood swings. They're going to be more fearful and, more anxious.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
we've talked about some of the things that can get in the way of that.
Yeah.
Screens at bedtime,
Mm-hmm.
inconsistent sleep schedules.
Yeah.
Even what they're eating can affect their sleep.
Yeah, for sure. So what can parents do?
I love the idea of creating a calming bedtime routine,
Okay.
So maybe a warm bath, dimming the lights, reading a story.
Nice. Yeah.
All of that signals to the body and mind that it's time to wind down.
Right.
And then that recommendation to turn off screens at least an hour before bed.
Yeah, that one's a hard one, but
It's so important, though.
yeah.
It
Makes such a difference. And then just thinking about the environment, dark, cool, and quiet.
Exactly.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of everything we talked about today.
Yeah.
We talked about 5 hidden triggers of anxiety in kids.
Right.
First, overscheduling and the need for downtime.
Yes.
Then, all of that processed food and sugar,
Mhm.
too much screen time,
For sure.
parental stress, and the emotional climate at home.
It matters.
And finally, the importance of good quality sleep.
Absolutely. And I think, the good news is that these are all areas where you can make positive changes.
Right, you don't have to do it all at once.
Exactly.
You can start small.
Yeah, even small changes can make a big difference.
Like, just committing to an hour of screen-free time before bed. Or even just like 15 minutes a day of just quiet playtime.
Right. It all adds up.
Yeah.
And it can have a really big impact.
So if you're listening to this and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, don't worry. You are doing a good job.
You are. You really are.
Just being here, learning about this stuff, that's a huge step.
Yeah, every little step you take towards understanding this,
Yeah,
it's a step in the right direction.
totally. So here's a thought for you to take away this week. Think about just one of those hidden triggers that we talked about today.
Okay.
And try to observe your child's routine through that lens, right? So maybe you keep track of their screen time for a day or really pay attention to what they're snacking on.
Yeah.
And then just think about one small adjustment that you could try.
Yeah, experiment a little.
In the coming week, you might be surprised by what you notice.
You really might.
All right, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.